Hello, and welcome to A Critical Dragon, where I talk about narrative in film, television, and in books. And today I am joined by my good friend, Dr. Philip Chase. Philip!
Hello, Dr. Canavan. How are you today?
And so today, Philip, we're doing another sort of spoiler-filled chat, and this time we're going to be talking about Steven Erikson's Midnight Tides, Book 5 of the Malazan Book of the Fallen. So before we get started, a couple of bits of orders of business. We've already done a non-spoiler chat about this. That's going to be hosted on your channel. I will link it in the description below. Please go and watch Philip's one. We don't repeat material.
Right.
Oddly enough, some of the stuff we talk about, we develop completely differently here. So it is worthwhile seeing both. And obviously, we're both charming, delectable fellows who you should listen to all the time.
Right. Absolutely.
So, Philip, apparently we should be calling these videos Why You Should Read Steven Erikson's Midnight Tides and not Spoiler Chat.
Yeah, well, yeah. I guess that's what sells, but we do have to warn people about the spoilers, unfortunately. So yeah, if you haven't read up to and including Midnight Tides in the Malazan Book of the Fallen, then you might not want to hear this unless you're totally fine with spoilers. But yeah.
And you know, that's a good point. We're now book 5 in the series. We're halfway through the series.
Yeah.
We've seen the initial story of Gardens of the Moon. Sort of part of that was closed off in Memories of Ice. We saw a new story thread, continent, and set of characters introduced in Deadhouse Gates. That reached, at least part of it reached a sort of conclusion in House of Chains. And now we're getting into the third leg, the third plot strand that Erikson is weaving in to create the Malazan Book of the Fallen. So this is a new continent. There are new characters. What do you think about that?
Well, I mentioned in the non-spoiler video that some of my favorite characters in the entire series are introduced here. I love the relationship between Tonal and Bugg, for example. I was really, I know we're going to talk about all these characters in more detail, but the Saren, do you say Pedak or Pedak, or how do you say her last name anyway? Is it
Saren Pedak?
Pedak? Okay, Saren Pedak.
I don't know. Steve and I did a video about this, and he pronounces her name completely wrong. So
yeah, I know, but I figure whatever you say, he'll say something else. So
I actually haven't figured out whether or not they wait for me to say something and then deliberately pick a different pronunciation, or if I've just been saying it wrong the entire time. I'm still unsure. And when you think about it, Erikson and Esselmont leaving the reader in ambiguity.
Yeah, it fits. Yeah, but her thread, her arc just blew me away in here. And I found it very, very poignant. And this introduction of a new continent thing, like you said, it is woven into the main narrative. We have, certainly there's Troll. Okay, so we have the character we can latch onto here. And we're even curious about. In fact, when we finished the 4th book, we left off with Troll about to tell his story. And in a way, this is the story he was about to tell. At least part of this was, or is, the story that we're told we're going to hear at the end of House of Chains. So here it is, right? So there's a nice segue, at least, that links them.
And that, it's one of those things that it's bizarre. In other series, where you have, like if you take Wheel of Time, where you had this whole continuous story that was very heavily focused on a very small group of characters, and there was a beginning, a middle, and an end, and there was a very clear trajectory of where this story was going.
Right.
And that straightforward narrative. Now, I am not saying it is bad. This is not a negative criticism, but it is a very straightforward style of narrative trajectory. Absolutely fine. We see Erikson deconstructing that narrative technique or that narrative style to try and do something slightly different about working in interweaving plot threads. And we see it on the macro scale with the structure of the Malazan Book of the Fallen. We see it on a micro scale in each book of the character threads interweaving. Yeah. And so the structure of the series kind of matches the structure of the novels, or vice versa, because it's all about different strands that appear initially very disparate, being woven together to create a cohesive narrative tapestry.
Right.
So I think that it's an interesting structural point, and it's one of my favorite things, narrative structure.
Yes. Yeah,
that I quite enjoy. But ending House of Chains, so starting House of Chains with that prologue of Trull, ending House of Chains with his promise to tell the story, and then starting this book that is Trull's story. This is basically what he is relaying, even though he's not the narrator, and we're going to get aspects of it that Trull doesn't know. But it gives us that narrative through line, that narrative connection from a previous book, that totally different characters, totally different setting, totally different themes. Or are those themes that we have seen so far totally different to what we see here?
Yeah. Oh, there are some good ones. I mean, there are themes that link all these books together, and then there are some that I feel like they're just much more prominent in here. We begin, I'm sure you're going to do a prologue video at some point, but we had this prologue with the idea of brotherhood introduced, and the idea of competition between brothers. And this is, of course, a foreshadowing for a lot of what we see in the course. We have the Bedict brothers, but we also have the Sengar brothers. And so that's a big theme in here. In a way, I feel like it's similar to how motherhood was so prominent in Memories of Ice. And brotherhood kind of comes to the fore here in Midnight Tides in a similar kind of way.
And we also have elements of Memories of Ice. Not only was there motherhood, but we had that element of sisterhood because of the poignancy of Tavor and Felicin, and how that ended up in House of Chains. So we had motherhood in Memories of Ice. We had sisterhood as a central plank of what we're working through.
Right.
And now we've moved on to brotherhood. And all of these, obviously, we're talking about familial relationships. We're talking, but not necessarily direct blood relation, because we're thinking found family, who you choose as family. Family in the broader sense is also being explored. Look at the relationship between Rhulad and
Udanas. Yes.
Where Rhulad obviously has his brothers, but the relationship he experiences with Udanas, we see that that's not necessarily camaraderie, but more much tighter than that. We also have Rhulad in those scenes talking about the loyal people who are following him as his brothers and sisters, this extension of family, this extension of clan, which is, again, showing how we construct family, how we construct these relationships is partly about perspective, and it's partly about what we value, and it's just sometimes partly about what we label.
It's interesting too how in these familial relationships the characters reenact trauma. In fact, going back to that prologue, you have this betrayal, which in the prologue, Scabandari Blood-Eye, as named by Animander's brother, Silchas Ruin. He actually betrays Silchas, stabs him in the back, and the Taist Idor slaughter the remaining Taist Andi. This betrayal is such a central event in the folklore and in the mythos of the Taist Idor, but it gets reversed. The betrayer becomes, Silchas Ruin becomes the betrayer, and Scabandari Blood-Eye becomes Father Shadow, who is this somehow remote. Actually, he's he's kind of not doing so well right now.
Lost a lot of weight.
He lost some weight after being pounded on the head by what's her name?
Well, to be honest, he's a shadow of his former self.
Oh dear. Oh dear. All right. Oh dear. So anyway, yeah, he is this betrayal is a defining event. And as I said, it becomes something that is reenacted. Betrayal is so central to Rhulad's story, for example. And the betrayal of Hanan Mosag, right? He has turned his back on Father Shadow and has made a deal with the crippled god. And so, there's that betrayal. Rhulad thinks he's betrayed all the time. And there's the ultimate betrayal, misunderstood, but of Udanas and of his brothers. And so this is such a huge theme in here.
But what I find really interesting is that betrayals in this story operate not only on multiple levels, but on different scales. So let's talk about Hanan Mosag just for a second. So sure. He betrays basically the worship of Shadow to make a deal with the crippled god. He is then betrayed in turn by the Sengar brothers. Because he sent them on a quest to get the sword, and Rhulad picked it up, so he can't have the sword. Then he betrays Rhulad. The crippled god, in granting this power to the Christening, is corrupting them and killing them and destroying them. So his granting of the power is actually at a cost. We have, even just within Hanan Mosag and that little tiny sphere of influence, these multiple aspects of betrayal. We have Rhulad betraying what he is meant to do to Hanan Mosag. He then betrays his eldest brother by demanding his eldest brother's betrothed as a wife. He betrays his oaths to worship Father Shadow because he's now going in this new direction. They betray the Letheri by refusing to even have a peace treaty. They go, no, we're just going to wipe you out. So betrayal mounts up, and betrayal is not necessarily portrayed as always evil. And so we have, when the Teist Eater betray the Letheri by going, no, you're not getting a peace treaty, we can view that as a betrayal. But when we look at it, when we see how one-sided it was, when we see how nefarious the Letheri were being with the treaty, when we see the the queen and the prince moving their forces are already in place. When we see that they had already orchestrated this plan to put the Eater in debt because of the harvesting. All of these things. Can you betray a betrayer? And it becomes very intricate because we see it from different angles, because we see it from the different sides. We're shown that one side's betrayer is another side's hero.
Speaking of which, it's also very prominent on the Letheri side of things. In the Bedict brothers, Hull Bedict has betrayed, or feels that he was betrayed by his own culture. And he feels that he was exploited, that he was used for his expertise in the various tribal cultures that the Letheris conquered using his knowledge. And he feels betrayed by that. And he in turn betrays the Letheri by siding with the Teist Eater. Tehol Bedict is betrayed.
Before we get to Tehol, what happens to Hull at the end?
Well, he's betrayed by the Nerek who stabbed him in the back.
So we can talk about all of these elements of betrayal. But I think one of the things is it becomes, because it's a narrative aspect that's being examined. I think looking at the ramifications of it, not necessarily just the justifications that people had for performing the actions,
Right.
But what does betrayal lead to in this?
Yep.
That betrayal in this story usually has disastrous effects, usually has personally disastrous effects, negative effects. And without without being didactic about it or polemic about it, that Erikson is exploring this idea, not necessarily that you always have to be absolutely honorable and true to your word, but that betraying someone, betraying a friendship, that first of all means that trust has to have been placed in you, or someone has trusted you. Because if no one trusts you, you can't betray them because they don't trust you in the first place. There has to be an element of trust. So betrayal and trust are bound together as these two aspects of the same thing. And that's part of what we're looking at, that you can have honorable intentions, as Hull did, with trying to make these tribal societies, integrating into them, understanding them. And then that knowledge is used in a way that he didn't intend.
Right.
But of course, the Narek are right to blame him. He betrayed them, because if they hadn't taken him in, if they hadn't treated him the way that they did, it might never have happened that way.
That's right.
But we see what Tehol has done, in that he has bought these islands so that the remnants of the Narek can be transported and will be safe from Lethari influence.
Right.
That all of this is a lot more complex than just betrayal bad. It's worked into different types of betrayal and different ramifications of betrayal on the small scale, on the personal scale, all the way up to the idea of betraying an entire civilization and watching it fall.
Right. Well, there's even self-betrayal. If you look at the character of Saren Pedic, and you look at I mentioned before, the patterns, the self-destructive patterns, the repetition of trauma. And in her, you see this ability to essentially delude herself. And this is something she realizes about herself. And when Baruch the Pale commits suicide, it is her consequent behavior is self-destructive. It is, and she only realizes later how she was acting out of guilt because she felt somehow that she was ignoring the obvious signs of where he was going to go, what he was going to do to himself. And she felt, and you get the sense that she hasn't had good relationships in the past.
Well, one of them was with Hull.
Yes, yeah, one of them was with Hull, and there's the whole tragedy of that relationship. And so Saren takes it out on herself, and she puts herself in a very dangerous situation in which she is indeed raped. And it is a really tough thing. And you and Steve, or you and Steven Erikson, took apart that chapter where she attempts to commit suicide, to repeat the trauma, and by going into the waves. And she is prevented from doing so by iron bars. She was a really wonderful character in here, by the way. But she is eventually helped by Corlo, the mage, who's along with the Crimson Guard, who helps her to understand, to break, in fact, this pattern of falling into this sorrow and this self-pity, this self-loathing that has kept her in this kind of self-destructive pattern. So in a sense, she's been betraying herself all along, and this trauma that keeps repeating. And it's a really powerful moment, I thought. The chapter that you and Steven Erikson broke down just beautifully, so I don't need to say too much about that, but also the moment when Corlo, through now which Warren is it that she's is it Makra or
Makra.
It's Makra, right? Yeah.
Well, I can never remember if it's Makra or Minias.
Yeah, I think it's
Makra though.
Yeah. Where he takes her through this very simple, very, very almost peaceful ritual where she's able to finally break this circle. And just a really wonderful arc in here, a really powerful thread I found.
Yeah, and but before we discuss any of that any further, one of the things that I really liked about this is all the way through this book, we have seen the crippled gods' corruption of magic. We have seen how the Eater have corrupted the Tistandi souls into shadow wraiths to use as weapons. We've seen this corruption of magic. We've seen magic consume people. We've seen it being used to destroy whole armies. Like, the scale of destruction here is frightening. And if we think back to the Siege of Peel, where there was this massive magical battle, here we're actually down ground level, and we see what happens when one side of mages is not strong enough to hold off the mage attack on the other side. Up until now, a lot of the mage battles have been one side has counteracted the other. And the Letheri were so convinced that their magic was powerful enough. And here we see the devastation that happens when that's not true. That magic is this horrendously destructive force. And Erikson adds this moment with Corlo as the smallest, gentlest counterexample of how magic can heal. And we have all of this grand devastation, but in this moment we have, but this is the aspect of magic that we should be using, we should be looking at. And I thought it was very beautifully done, because it's not thrown in your face that here is the counterexample to this devastating, monstrous magic. It's just a little moment that's dropped in there. And because it's a fantasy world, because we know that magic exists, we kind of forget the importance of magic as a symbol of power, and how power can be absolutely abusive, but power can be used to heal, to help. And I just wanted to highlight that one little point, because I thought it was just such a nice moment that's dropped in there.
Yeah, it's also lovely how Erikson weaves in the explanation of warrens and magic during the exchanges between Saren and Corlo. So that was the moment I was talking about in the non-spoiler video, where, hey, if you want an explanation of warrens, this is maybe one of the best ones in terms of how, because she asks him, okay, what are these warrens? How do they work? You know, and it's just woven in there very nicely. You know, it's a part of the story, and it was a necessary part of the story as he's trying to gently bring her to this point where she's ready for this healing. So really,
and again, it's one of the oldest narrative tricks in the book, which is you take a character who doesn't know something and have them ask someone who does, and as it's explained to them, it's going to be explained to the reader. And you know, people can say, oh, that's a really boring trope, or that's a really boring or stupid thing to put in, and it's very, but it's so well integrated into this that it's not immediately obvious that Erikson went, no, this is my opportunity to give the reader some exposition and some explanation for the magic, because I know that readers want to know more. Remember, we're 5 books in. He's when he was writing this, he'd already had feedback from fans at signings, or seen reviews where people had said X or Y about it. So we can see how Erikson is developing and tweaking his style as he is writing the series. It's not that he sat down and wrote book 1 to 10 all in a single sitting, and therefore it is all cohesive. Like, this is a couple of years after the very Gardens of the Moon was published, that things will slowly change over time as the author changes over time, as the author is exploring new things.
Yeah. Another thing that he handles, I think, with much subtlety is the theme we talked about earlier in the non-spoiler video of capitalism and power and corruption and exploitation, the exploitation of these native peoples, the Narek and the Tonal and the others, and the idea of civilization versus the noble savage. Now, when he sets this up, it's not a this versus that kind of thing. It's way more complex the way he treats this. It isn't civilization bad, noble savage good, right? There is no, the Leatheri are not the good guys. The Taist Idor are highly flawed. They're all flawed. And when you talk about the treatment of capitalism here, as we said earlier, it's not, oh, capitalism bad. It's here's how this can play out, especially when taken to an extreme form, when the worship of capital, and of course he's got, what is he called? The tolls, right? Is the stock market, essentially. Yeah. I just thought that he handled this with much subtlety and with lots of great insights in here. The dichotomy between, you know, Taist Idor versus Leatheri is a lot more complex than even the characters within the story want to think it is. And there's this whole thing about the Taist Idor taking over. They're the new empire, but they're going to be absorbed culturally in some very important ways by the Leatheri way of life.
Well, the question is posed at the end. If you have conquered a nation, does the nation change to conform to you?
Right.
Or are you changed to conform to that nation? And when we see Rhulad and when we see them in the palace at the end, the focus there is the Eater way of life will not survive controlling the Leatheri. We know that note is left hanging in the air that will be obviously picked up and explored later. But to go back to the start of this, I think one of the interesting things is, so when we look at the Taist Eater as, you know, Erikson examining the noble savage, let's look at the point of connections between the Eater and the Leatheri, because both societies, regardless of ideology towards capitalism, money, any of finance, any of that sort of stuff, both of them have taken an ideological way of life and have exaggerated it almost to an extreme. When you look at the Taist Eater, it's not that they have a balanced tribal society. It is an extreme tribal society. The structures, the formalism of how they have structured their society, the relationships within the society, everything is stratified. Everything is laid out according to these very specific traditions, these very specific behaviors, and you are not allowed to deviate from it. It is an extreme form. When we look at the Leatheri, it's not just that it is a capitalist empire. It's not just that it is a colonial, expansionist European empire. It is all of those things. But again, it has been taken to this extreme where they have almost exaggerated every notion and focused on that one single point and go, this is our defining characteristic. So both societies have idealized a specific ideology and a specific way of living to the exclusion of all else. And I think that is one of the big things that's being explored. It's not necessarily, well, obviously, tribal versus civilized, the hunter-gatherer and that idea of society versus the stock market and capitalism. Those things are being explored. But I think it goes much deeper than that, that it's about a structure of society that is focused, solely focused on one thing to the exclusion of all else. And because of that, there's no flexibility. It is an extreme position. And that's where we see a massive point of connection between the two.
Yes. It's interesting too how Erikson reflects their differences tonally in the book. So the Taist Idor portions of the story, when you have the narrative perspective or the POV of Troll and Udanas. Now Udanas is Leatheri, but he's in he's a slave of the Taist Idor, and his parts are in the Taist Idor. He's the observer many times of what's happening, along with Troll in that part of the story. And the tone here is very elevated in some way. It's not inaccessible at all, but it is it's more formal, and it has a very tragic undertones to it, and it's it's more serious, and it feels epic, and there's this vast past history underlying it and all of this. Whereas the tone in the beginning, especially when we're in Leatheros with Tehol, for example, and Bugg, or Shirk, or all of their escapades, which we need to talk about. But the tone is much more comedic. It is, for the most part, lighter. But gradually, these two portions, these two civilizations, come together, and the tone sort of becomes a blend of these things by the end. When you have this conflict that smashes them together, there's a blending of tone as well. It's very interesting how he's done this. I think it's just beautifully done.
And I obviously I like when Erikson plays with structure. I like it when authors play with structure and play with how you amalgamate these different things in a narrative. Right. And it's something that quite frequently gets overlooked, because yes, you can notice tone, but it's, as you've just pointed out and isolated, it's very specific to certain things that, as the book comes to its conclusion, as we get that convergence, we
Right.
see the bleeding of, as the Eater are swarming down into Leatheros, that the Letheri tone that had been established earlier is changed.
Right.
And we get this melding because we have the Eater are now in Leatheros. Like,
Right.
it's subtly done, it's worked in, and it's where we see that point of connection between theme, tone, structure, all the way down through multiple levels.
That's beautiful. And you can even pinpoint very specific things, like in the earlier sections in Leatheros, it was lovely how he would have, at the end of a section, there would be a word or a phrase that would be repeated at the beginning of the next section. And there's this very Jeeves and Wooster kind of vibe going on, especially with Tehol and Bugg, of course. But it's playful. But that playfulness by the end has been muted considerably. It's not totally gone, but it has been muted by the meshing with the tragic elements in the book. And it's amazing, actually, how he set this up.
And it's interesting about tone, because we could talk about the ebb and flow of tone, but obviously, like, the book's called Midnight Tides.
Yes.
We have the dark water flowing in. We have the Eater invasion of Letheri. We have this movement, like Seren Pedek walking into the water to try to commit suicide. We have the Sengar brothers walking to frozen water. Through frozen water, to find the sword, the cursed sword that is there. The symbol of water, because then we get to the lake at the end, that gets frozen over with the demon inside. We have Bugg being revealed as male, and all of that water imagery, all of the water metaphors, all of the water descriptions that had been associated with Bugg all the way through, suddenly take on additional meaning and additional resonance.
Yes.
But we have a lot of things emerging from the water, water closing over things. We have Breeze down in astrally projecting down into the water to meet the old guardian of the gods.
Yeah.
The water imagery is throughout this, and yet when you think about it, it's not about naval battles. It's not about the stuff happening at sea. It's all about the land. And so I think people might look at it and go, why is it called Midnight Tides? There's no water in this. Everything is water. And water is one of those fascinating symbols that we see in literature because it is transformative. It's frequently associated with the feminine. And obviously that's in contrast to what we've said is very masculine about this, about brotherhood, about the fraternal or fraternities that we see explored. But if we think about water as feminine, then midnight water, instead of it being the bright water, the inverse of it. So is this a signal that this is masculine water? Like all of these different things. And I appreciate someone's going to say, oh, AP, you're reading too deep into this. You're overthinking it. But it's not that there has to be a definitive meaning. These are suggestions, and it becomes suggestive as you're reading the text. And once you're aware that water is so important to this, you start picking up on that. And when you cast your mind back to the prologue of House of Chains about the drowned world, and you get the scene in here where Rhulad orders that to happen.
Right.
That the points of connection of all of this water, all of these aspects of the imagery, the fact that time as a river, time gets frozen in place in ice and there's no stopping the tide. The myth of, or the legend of King Canute.
Right.
All of these things are being evoked because Erikson plays with them and works them in.
Yeah. Yeah. If you've been waiting to find out how that fragment of curled emerald got flooded, well, here it is. You finally get to find out. And then the characters in the previous books have been playing around in that. It's also brilliant, I think, how the idea of tides is associated with the waves coming in. And then again, that you have that repetition, the repetition of trauma, the repetition of behavior, the patterns, that I talked about before, the familial and the personal patterns. So it's just so wonderfully tied together. It really is. Let's see. We have some other great themes.
Well, one more point on this then.
Sure.
Think about the balance of power at the beginning between the Eater and the Letheri.
Right.
And the Letheri sweep forward with their plan, and then the Eater counter it and they sweep forward. So again, you have that backwards and forwards motion of the tide coming in and going out, depending on your perspective.
Yeah.
And the fact that the point of the flashpoint of the war, the over harvesting of these seals, and I know for a modern audience that might seem very strange, but when we think of the fact that England and France, in my living memory, had wars over who was allowed to fish cod off the coast of the UK, or who owned those waters, and the Navy being sent out to adjudicate between fishermen starting these fights. It was called Cod Wars.
Right.
When we go back to the 19th century and whaling, when we go back to the 18th century, the 17th century, that we see these resources, we might look at it and go, this is so silly. This is not silly, because when you think of the Eater society, they use the tusks to make tools out of, to ornament things. The tusks have value to them. They use the meat, they use the blubber for oil. Every aspect of these animals, this is the difference between them starving to death or living. This is life and death for them. For the Letheri, this is a commodity to be exploited. Right. And when we think of Letheri society, that idea of commodity and value, that is life and death as well. Think of Udanas. Udanas is a slave. All slaves are the same, except, well, he's an indebted slave. And you go, but how can he have it? He's a slave. Like, well, but Featherwitch is a free slave because she doesn't have any debt. Right. And Udanas is an indebted slave. Exactly. Even within these groups, there's value judgments being made. Sorry, just to barge in with that.
Oh, no, it's great. You know what you made me think of too, in terms of historical parallels. I have heard Stephen Erikson talk about the Malazan Empire being, in some ways, a reflection of the British Empire. But I feel like, for me, as I was reading about the Letheri Empire, I'm thinking about my own history. I'm thinking about the United States of America in many ways, and manifest destiny, right? In the 19th century, the slaughter of the Native American tribes, and the many, many, many treaties that were made with them that were broken again and again and again. I don't know if he had that in mind. I suspect he did.
He's actually posted on his Facebook page specifically about this point, and it's specifically about a certain aspect of that was what he was thinking of about the Eater actually conquering the Letheri. That I am so sorry, because I've forgotten the name of the Native American tribe. Was it the Dakota?
It could be, Dakotas,
but when they sort of were counterattacking, and it's whether or not what if they had actually won and conquered and taken the White House, had taken over America, what would have happened to the Native American tribe? What would have happened to the First Nation peoples? What ramifications would that have? That is obviously an inspiration, because he's spoken about it quite clearly. but it might be an inspiration. But again, I think people see that one point of connection and go, oh, that's what the book's about.
Right. Yeah.
And I'm always trying not to say, no, you've missed the point. It's about more than that. But
yes,
that's not fair to people who have seen that aspect. You go, yes, that is one of the aspects, but it is not the defining aspect. And it's not that Erikson is saying, yes, this should have happened. He's exploring something.
Right. It is a point of inspiration. It is not an allegory or any kind of other, kind of representation that goes, A equals B and C equals D right along the whole way. But it is interesting, the dynamic there, and the idea of the Leavery's sense of manifest destiny is much like the sense of my ancestors going across this continent. This is ours, obviously, because we're the winners. And not only that, but I'm pretty sure that God wants us to own all of this and have all of this and introduce our way of living to these people. And they don't really imitate us all that well, but aren't they tragic?
Well, here's an aspect that obviously, because of your background and your upbringing, you can see those points of connection with American history, because Stephen Erikson was Canadian, obviously First Nation. A lot of that is a shared history with North America.
It happened in Canada too. Yeah.
And obviously, Canada, America screwing over Native groups. It's not like that's just in the past. That is something that carries on today. It's not over. It's different. It's usually done by economic treaties. But think about it from my perspective. What island am I from?
The beautiful island of Ireland.
What language am I speaking?
English, with a great accent, by the way.
But why am I speaking English? Why is English my native language?
Well, it was simply put, it was an attempt at cultural annihilation on the part of the colonizers. The history goes so far back, as you know. I don't have to tell you. And
I will say to anyone watching that this is not a political rant about this. It's to go to the greater point that we can look at this book and say, yes, it's about a Native American tribe and America. We can say it's about a First Nation tribe and the North American expansion. Or we can take it that step back into a more general sense and not assign it to a specific nation, but think about it in terms of the themes that have already been developed of a colonizer and the colonized, of a generic European power, a generic civilized society, taking over or attempting to take over a less civilized society. And thinking about it in terms of imperialism, thinking about it in terms of colonialism, that I think actually gives you a more interesting perspective of the power dynamics at play here than honing in on one specific example. Because when we take it that step back to that broader picture of what is colonialism, when we see what the Leavery have done to the Narek about wiping out their culture, wiping out their language, wiping out their traditions, about taking them in, but making them third-class citizens within the society, and keeping them down. You go, this is not a commentary about America. This is a commentary about what a powerful civilized nation does when it conquers. And it mightn't intend that. This is not saying that the Leavery went, ha ha ha, we're going to be all evil, Machiavellian, mustache twirling. We'll take over and we're going to make them all slaves. It's the structure of the society. It is the process in and of itself of colonialism and the ramifications of that, where you set up the colonized are always going to be at a disadvantage. And the ramifications of that through history have been played out in every imaginable scenario.
All over the world. And it's also worth noting, as you pointed out before, the Thais Edor are not some stereotypical noble savage culture either, right? There's a lot more going on there. and there are some interesting power dynamics that are, there's a lot of vying for power. You've got Hanan Mosag, and you've got Rhulad, and you've got this, they were, of course, 5 or 6, I can't remember how many, there were different Tais Idor that have been brought together by Hanan Mosag. But their motivations and what they become, the hints at what they're going to become, it's not pretty either. It's not a good thing. And you have characters who I liked in the beginning, like Theridas Boone, right? He seemed like a kind of a cool guy. He's one of the Tais Idor friends. He's, I think, a contemporary of Fear. We need to talk about Fear a little bit too, and his cowardice and so forth. But Theridas, I liked him. Yes, indeed. Oh dear. But he, back to Theridas Boone, he was a character I liked, but he's the one who stomps all over that old man who was trying to save Tehol. He's the one who nearly kills Tehol. He acts like a brutal, awful person, and he's, you know, I thought this guy was kind of cool before, but look at him, what he's doing, and he's ganging up on these people in a moment of pure, just nasty anger. I mean, and what has happened is this: they've marched across this continent, and they transformed into something else.
But you know, and again, we see this in when we demonize the enemy, when we turn the enemy into other.
Yeah.
And think about this honorable warrior from Idor society.
Right.
What they have just gone through. This has not been tribal warfare.
Right.
This has not been warfare. This has been a monstrous, magical annihilation of the other.
Right.
And the Idor are well aware of the Letheri. They have Letheri slaves. And we're even told at the beginning, you know, they treat their slaves well. They don't work them to death.
Right.
Because obviously you have nice treatment to slaves. But what we see with these noble, or at least tribal warriors,
right,
the form of warfare that they are exposed to transforms them. That they either have to be reduced to something other than people, otherwise what they have done,
right,
is a crime that can never be undone.
The Letheri, yes. Yeah.
And when you think of that, your self-defense mechanism, either I have committed and participated in in a genocide, in a crime that is almost unimaginable.
Right.
Do I admit my participation, or do I go, well, they're not really human. Right. They're monsters. They are evil. They don't have a soul. They are animals.
Which is interesting.
Think about the language that we use, even in today's society, to describe other aspects of human society that we don't like.
Even people of the opposite political party, you know, it's really something. And so you have this Theridas character who seemed like a noble, good character who assumes that Udanas has betrayed Rhulad right at the end. He also assumes that when he comes across Tehol, who was trying to help Mayen as she had stabbed herself, he automatically assumes, oh, you stabbed her. And the look that Tehol gives him in that moment of knowing, it's almost a look of pity. You know, it's not oh no, he's not, he knows what's coming. Tehol knows what's coming. And he knows that they cannot see, they being the Tais Idor warriors who have come across this scene, they cannot see what is actually happening because they have this idea in their minds that Letheri, animals, monsters, what have you. So the assumption is, oh, you must have killed Mayen. How dare you? And we're gonna really work you over before we kill you. You know. So,
but interesting aspect about even the tribal society, when you think of when we first see the Idor society, and it is gender divided. The men do this, the women do that. And you go, oh, that's a very old-fashioned notion. You know, that the men have all the power and the women are sent off to their own thing. But of course, over the course of the novel, you see, no, because the women of the society have the power for certain things. They have the knowledge that Hassan Mosag stole.
Right.
But that was part of the woman's history. That was separate to the man's history.
Right.
And we realize our notions of what gender are and how gender should function, or sex, or how society should be stratified or not stratified.
Right.
These notions are actually, while we might think they're simple and straightforward, are highly complex. And what can seem a very bad gendered, oh, this is a terrible society, is far more nuanced than our modern perspective sometimes allows us to see.
Absolutely.
But when we look at the theory, there's no distinction between men and women about power levels.
Right.
It's, you know, everyone is treated as either rich or destitute, indentured, who's going to be my slave. You know, is one that's a gender equal society right there, ladies and gentlemen. But it's one that favors only a very small minority of people, and everyone else is a victim.
Yeah, and in regard to the Thais Idor, I think the person with her eyes most open, who really knows what's going on, is probably the Sengar matriarch, Uruth. She seems to know what's happening long before it's happening. She is the one who preserves, along with the other women, the actual knowledge of the past. Their narrative is not the BS narrative that's been handed down about the betrayal that the Thais Idor were victims to. They know that the Thais Idor were the betrayers. So it's, and of course Uruth remains connected to Kurald Emerlan long after Hanan Mosag has betrayed it. So yeah, it's a very interesting thing. Alrighty. So I think we have a few other characters that we want to touch on before we finish here. And we haven't said too much about the comedic characters that we meet in Leatheros. Obviously, there's the wonderful relationship between Tonal and Bugg, but there's also Shirk, who is a character that I absolutely loved. And Quick Jen did a wonderful video on Shirk.
It is a brilliant video. I will make sure to put it in the description. Yeah. Everyone should go and see Quick Jen's video on Shirk Alal. It is a fantastic video. Bearing in mind, there are slight spoilers for later on, but only in the vaguest sense.
Tiny.
It is worth watching that video. Quick Jen, absolutely brilliant video on this.
Yeah, it's wonderful. And there's some just great lines in there. I remember one where I think it's Tonal is asking Bugg how Shirk is getting along with Ublala, and Bugg replies, swimmingly. Because of course the two of them both have participated in the drownings, and of course there's the other layer there where Bugg of course is male. So there's just the wordplay in here is so much fun, but you also have Shirk's quest to feel, I guess, is that how we want to put it?
Well, it part of being alive is the feeling of being alive. And the most life affirmative act is sex. Right. Yeah, it's why there's a weird phenomenon of people hooking up at funerals.
Yeah,
very disturbing thing, but apparently it's a thing.
Is it really?
Yeah, because going to a funeral, you have it at weddings, and one of the reasons it happens at weddings is not only the romance, but also people sitting there going, "I'm unwed," and this is reminding me of that, and it's this sort of reminder that you're kind of desperate and you go and find someone.
Yeah.
Funerals have a different effect, which is it's a reminder of your own mortality.
Oh, better get going.
And therefore, the unconscious is looking for a life-affirming act. It is, there are psychological studies on this. It's a really weird phenomenon. But
yeah, interesting.
Shirk as the comedic sort of version of this, whereas Kettle as the much more serious. So again, two sides of a coin.
Yeah.
But with Shirk, we get that the devil may care thief. This powerful, entertaining. What was it that Quick Jen called her? vampire, or no, undead sex pirate.
Sex pirate. Yeah.
But she's not reduced to a sexual object. This is not a reduction of her femininity or reduction of what femininity means. This is very much, she chooses this because this is what she wants, and she doesn't want a man to control her. It's not about that aspect. It's she's in control of her own destiny.
Right.
Obviously, we're slightly uncomfortable talking about this. Two men talking about female sexuality. Let's mansplain some more.
Yeah. We probably should talk to Quick Jen at some point. You know?
Yeah, just go and watch Quick Jen's video. She's much better at this.
Yeah. She does a great job talking about the comedy and the sexuality of this character, which is wonderful. Shirk is a great character, and I'm so glad that she's part of the story. And of course, there's T-Hull and Bugg and the rest.
And T-Hull and Bugg were one of the highlights. The very first time I read the Malazan Book of the Fallen, where Krupp was a character that I did not enjoy in my first read. Yeah. Iskaril Pust is still a character I don't really enjoy. Now, I can appreciate how well he's done, but I don't really enjoy him. But T-Hull and Bugg, I can read their sections endlessly, because it is Jeeves and Wooster. It is the master-servant relationship played up in that way. It is Blackadder and Baldric. But there's the real sense that both sides are outsmarting the other.
Yeah.
And enjoying being outsmarted by the other.
And knowing on some level they're being outsmarted by the other. And it's just so funny how T-Hull at the end is just kind of, isn't it odd how we've been eating just little bits and pieces of garbage and we seem remarkably healthy, you know? And you have to think that he knows who Bugg is, or has some inkling, I would think, that this his manservant is more than meets the eye.
And it's clear that T-Hull obviously knew something, and it may be that he had worked it out, or had worked out an aspect of it. But when it's confirmed, Bugg Mail is, I'll wipe your memory. But then later on, it's like, I'm glad it didn't.
Yeah.
Because they just carry on. But they carry on exactly as they were before. If you remember George Bernard Shaw's Pygmalion, Eliza, where the devil are my slippers? That's how this ends. It's that same sensibility being played in for laughs. But one of the things I really enjoyed about this, not only all of the water imagery that has been through the book, especially in the sections with Bugg.
Right.
But when you think of what he was doing, about how did he get rid of all of that water? And it's like, oh yes, well, he dug these shafts down to fill with, it's because he's in control of water, and it's all tied into this. And suddenly all of that makes so much more sense.
Yes. Yeah. It's kind of handy being the god of ocean or whatever he is. Yeah, it has its perks, I guess.
But when you have that moment where Withel prays to Mail, and it cuts to the scene where Bugg looks round because he can hear, he goes, someone call my name. And, it's right there for the reader. But and I think careful, active reading, you would pick up on it a lot earlier. But I know for a fact that a lot of people did not pick up on who Bugg was until the reveal. And it's a wonderful moment. And regardless of when you figure it out, it's still, on a reread, knowing it from the beginning, it is still enjoyable. That knowing who Bugg is does not ruin how enjoyable those scenes are.
True. And the other god who's present here, a very old-fashioned in some ways, because if correct me if I'm wrong, but I feel like Opon has replaced the errant in the Malazan world, but because this place, this continent is frozen in a sense. It is backward in a sense in terms of the magic being so brutal and blunt. you have this older trickster god of luck, push and pull sort of thing, the errant, who isn't part of the gang in other parts of the world. Is that correct, or
what's interesting is, in the other parts of the world, we have the deck of dragons and the warrens,
right?
And we see that Perrin has become master of the deck.
Yes.
And the errant is in a part of the world that has been frozen in time. We saw that implied at the beginning in the prologue. Again, prologues, really important, people.
Yeah. Frozen.
But frozen in time, and that has slowed time. It has held them in the past. And so this is an area, a continent, where the holds, the precursors, the primal energies of magic hold sway. And the errant is master of the holds.
Right.
And so this is setting the errant up, both revealing him as master of the holds is similar to that reveal of Perrin as master of the deck, but also then, so you have that nice parallel, but we then have them being set up in opposition.
Right. And you also have the thawing that's going on, which is resulting in the hold of death emerging with the death of the Azath. And that's kind of important too, because they've never heard of Hood. You know, when Ironbar says Hood's balls, Saren's like, who's Hood? You know,
but even better, Hood's balls. Well, yes, he has them. What of it?
And he does have balls, he says. Yes, this is very important. So I think we've covered almost everyone, except maybe we could say another bit about the relationship between troll and fear. We haven't talked a lot about that yet.
The Sengar brothers, troll and fear. I think we need to talk about that and their relationship with Rhulad, just to go over that. But also we need to talk a bit more about Breeze.
Oh yes, Breeze, of course, and the Sita and that whole my goodness, there's so many threads here.
When I first read it, I obviously pronounced his name Briss, and I thought his storyline was cut short.
But now that you're familiar with it, it's all just a breeze, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's talk about fear and troll and Rhulad and Benadas. And initially, I'll give you my initial impressions of them, and then I'd like to hear you talk through this, because fear initially comes across. Now, obviously, we know troll from the prologue of House of Chains. We know that he is shorn by his brothers.
Yes.
And that initially then sets up, when we realize this is troll, when we realize that's this story, we know where this is going. We are already prefiguring tragedy. But we see fear come in, and fear seems to be very much the stereotypical elder brother, the noble, the great warrior, the one that everyone looks up to. And his name is Fear. You can't help but attach something to that. And then we have Troll, who obviously we know a bit about, and he seems like the Michael Corleone, that he's smarter and capable of abstract thinking, but is still a great warrior, and he looks up to his elder brother and wants to make his elder brother proud.
Right.
But he questions aspects of their society. And of course, that calls back to Karsa and that whole thing where we talked about, when you're in your culture, it is very difficult to question your society's values unless you've been exposed to something else. And here we have Troll doing that, which is actually, it's a nice point of contrast between the characters. And then we have Benadas, who is the apprentice sorcerer, the learned wanderer who never wants to stick around the village, and he likes to go out, and he's friends with Hull. And seems strange, but we find out that he's being trained in magic, that yes, we expect him to be slightly different because magic. And then we have Rhulad, the cocky, shitty, youngest child, the bloody baby of the family, who gets treated better than everyone else, gets away with everything else, is never bloody punished for anything. And he's the cocky, arrogant teenager. except you realize that they're all quite old.
Right, of course, because they're ties to Edor. Yeah.
But he's the cocky teenager.
Yeah.
Everyone else is a blooded warrior, and he is unblooded. And
Yes.
he has a sense of inferiority. He has a sense that he needs to prove himself.
That's right.
And, you know, his eldest brother is betrothed, so he's constantly flirting with his eldest brother's betrothed. And she flirts back because it's harmless, and it's good to have an ally.
Right.
In your in-laws' house.
Yeah. I do think that Mayan also has a bit of a sadistic streak in her, and Fear realizes that, of course, as well before the end. But it's so interesting. I found myself really feeling rather sorry for Rhulad, actually. I felt really terrible. Yes, he does some pretty shitty things in this book, in this story, some horrible things out of a sense of insecurity, wanting to prove himself, and many other reasons. But here's this, as you say, the equivalent of a teenager who's been put into this position of being used. He's been horribly used and exploited by Hanan Mosag and the crippled god. And it's to see him at the end with all of his tendons cut and lying on the floor and screaming, pleading, begging for help from his brothers who, for his own good, don't want to help him in the way he wants. It's a really pitiable situation, I think. But
again, the series, this book, the entire series, when we keep talking about compassion, and people think that the series says you must be compassionate,
right?
It is exploring the theme of compassion, and ultimately, I think the series decides that on the whole, compassion is a good thing.
Yeah.
But it still explores aspects where compassion goes horribly bloody wrong.
Yeah.
We have Itkovian and his compassion for the Talana Mass having massive repercussions.
Oh, yeah.
We have the compassion that Fear shows Rhulad coming back to bite him in the ass because Rhulad goes, my first act as emperor, I want your fiance.
Yeah.
We have when Rhulad has had his tendons cut and is absolutely helpless and no longer a threat.
Right.
The compassion of the guardian
to
put him out of his misery.
Oops.
Compassion is not just one thing in this series.
Right.
Compassion, again, like all of these concepts, like all of these emotions, like all of these themes, is being explored from different angles to show you the good and the bad, to show you the cost, to show you one aspect over another, so that ultimately by the end of the series, you come down on it and you go, you know what? I've considered all the angles, and I take your point. I think this is the way to go. I agree with Erikson that ultimately, although there are downsides to compassion, there are ramifications to compassion. Ultimately, those are worth the price of living that way.
Yeah, beautifully said. Yeah, you see it in the relationship between Fear and Troll as well. I think there's a lot of baggage there, but there's a lot unspoken between these two, and it emerges at the end that Fear actually looked up to Troll in some important ways. The Troll is the one. I love Troll. He's such an interesting character. He's such a misfit, but he's the one who thinks outside the box. He's the one who's very he reflects. You know, he's unusually capable among his people of self-reflection. And that sets him apart. It gets him into some serious trouble. And you think most of the time that Fear is just so annoyed with him and mad at him, but really Troll is expressing the doubts that Fear himself has. And Fear actually admires him for that on some level. So it's a really beautiful thing how that plays out.
And I think part of that is, if you remember, Fear is the eldest. He's the heir apparent. He's the inheritor of this. He is going to be, when his father dies, the paterfamilias, the head of the household. So he is defined and bound by all of those strictures, all of those traditions. He
Right.
must act in a certain way. He is the weapon master for the tribe. And when Hanan Mosag unites all the tribes, he is weapon master for all of the tribes. And then he is the general of the army. That
Right.
all of these things bind him, bind his actions, bind his reactions. He's not allowed to express himself in different ways. And he sees Trull, and Trull is free to do all this.
Right.
And he is envious of Trull because Trull can have these thoughts, can express these thoughts, whereas Fear is not allowed to do that.
Right.
And yet
And he's also afraid to.
And we have Trull looking at Fear and being envious of Fear because Fear never has any doubts. Fear is respected. No one ever says a bad word about Fear. You have all of this grit. How can you blah, blah, blah? And again, it's all about perspective. It's all about seeing things from different angles.
Yep.
And when we get that whole revelation about Mayan and about everything that's going on, and we've gotten past the scene of the coins popping off certain parts of Rhulad's anatomy.
Yeah.
Oh
dear.
Ding dong.
Tingle, tingle, tingle.
But we see that Fear knew about this. Fear knew that Rhulad was thinking a lot of these things.
Right.
But it wasn't his place to challenge his younger brother, because if he did that, he would have to kill him. Or have him cast out and be shorn and removed from the family history, to be removed from reality, to be removed from existence.
Right.
Those were Fear's options, because if he called out an unblooded warrior, A, it was beneath him as a blooded warrior to do it.
Right.
But B, the reaction must be total. So Fear can't do it. And he doesn't, Trull keeps drawing attention to it. He's like, stop doing it. I will be married to her, and then I can just cuff him on the back of the head.
Right. Right.
So the complexity of that we don't get initially, we don't realize initially, but when we see it explored at the end, when they are finally being honest to each other because they have freed themselves from the society. They have left Rhulad behind. And obviously, well, Trull goes back, but they have left that. They have left society. They have left their burdens. They have left those strictures, those structures. And finally, they can talk to each other.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting, and a lot of the dynamic between them is dictated by the cultural, mores and that sort of thing. I mean, they have to behave a certain way. It's marvelous how Erikson has created this whole culture with all of these. There's no point in here where it's just, here are the rules. You just gradually understand them. The way he weaves them into the story is really quite nice. And he does that with all the cultures in here, actually. So really great stuff. And this book happens before Gardens of the Moon in terms of the timeline.
Just shortly before Gardens of the Moon. So again, it's one of those ones where suddenly, when you're paying attention to the dates on the start of things, on the epigraphs and that sort of stuff, that date stamp allows you to place this in context. And obviously, when we think about House of Chains and where it began, but then how it ended, we can see that how that book ended, basically what happened in that time period. And now this one is slotting in before it. This is a non-chronological sequence. So it plays with all of these things. But if you'd called it a prequel, you would have had a different attitude to it. And even if you don't realize that this comes before, it's still a great book. But suddenly, once you realize that it is ahead of these other books, you go, that is how the rent formed that led to the river being diverted. That is, so that is definitely Trull, and that's how he ended up here. So something bad is about to happen to him at the end of this book. That, this explains why Mael was doing certain things, or where he appears in the series, because this had happened beforehand. This explains why suddenly all these things are coming to a head now, because an Azath has died. Some of the ascendants and gods are waking up, and we all know that power attracts power. that
Right.
this is the beginning of this climax, that this thing that it is building toward. So it thematically, structurally, all of these things play into each other, and that's why it's so much fun. That, well, one of the reasons why I find it so much fun.
Oh yeah, indeed. And here we are, halfway there.
Halfway there. So are there any other points? I know we didn't really talk about Breeze. We've skipped over like some of the really interesting scenes, but I think we've had a fairly comprehensive discussion of a lot of the stuff, because everyone has favorite scenes, everyone has favorite characters, and you know, it's always good fun to discuss this stuff in the comments and maybe return to it in another discussion in another time. But
yeah,
anything else that you feel that we have to add as a really important point?
I don't think so. We can let our viewers leave it in the comments, and maybe you and Stephen Erikson can dissect the scenes they mentioned at some point. That would be fantastic.
Well, that's always an option, but we've already done one from Midnight Tides.
This is true, and it was beautifully done. If you haven't watched that, everybody, watch that breakdown that AP and Stephen Erikson did of that scene where Saren goes into the waves and is brought out by iron bars. It's just a beautiful scene, and you guys did a wonderful job of laying it out. Another masterclass. So good stuff.
Well, in that case then, Philip, thank you so much for having this conversation with me, for coming on so that we can chat about these books. I really, every time I look forward to it, every time I enjoy it, and every time you bring up points in ways or from a different perspective than the ones that I would have thought of. So it's always making me think more about the text. So thank you.
Oh, well, I mean, I could say exactly those words right back to you. So it's just marvelous. I feel like I'm getting so much out of this read. I'm getting so much out of it. And it is really because of this collaboration. And I would have enjoyed it, you know, my second time through, no matter what. But this has made it just so much fun, so meaningful to me. So thank you so much, AP. And thank you for having me on your channel. It's been a lot of fun.
Always a pleasure to have you here. So that just leaves me to say thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.